I took the job because my uncle died and left me the deed, and because I owed $17,000 to people I didn't want to owe it to anymore. The cemetery sat on 40 acres of ridgeland in Greenbrier County, 2 hours past anything resembling a town. The lawyer's office in Lewisburg handled the paperwork. My uncle had been the caretaker for 31 years. Before him, his father. Before that, someone else whose name didn't matter now. The deed came with a small stipend from a trust, $400 a month, and a caretaker's cottage with propane heat and a well that still worked. The lawyer said the position required residence, no commute, no weekends off. He left instructions, the lawyer said, sliding a manila envelope across his desk. You'll want to read them before you drive up. I drove up first. The road turned to gravel 3 miles before the entrance. The gate was iron, rusted orange at the joints, and it hung open. I parked the truck near the cottage and walked the grounds before I unpacked. 230 graves, most of them old enough that the names had worn smooth. The stones sat in uneven rows across the slope. Above the cemetery, the ridge continued into oak and hemlock. Below, the land dropped into a hollow I couldn't see the bottom of. The cottage had 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a propane stove, and a bathroom where the pipes knocked when the water ran. A wood stove sat in the main room. The radio on the kitchen counter was older than I was, a heavy black Motorola hardwired to an external antenna. A handwritten note taped to its face read, "Channel 9 only." I found the logbook in the desk drawer. My uncle's handwriting filled the pages, entries dated and timed. Most were short. Checked fence line. Gate secure. No issues. Some noted weather. A few mentioned supplies. The last entry was dated 11 days before his death. Protocol followed, morning clear. I opened the envelope that night. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, handwritten, and a hand-drawn map of the cemetery with certain graves marked in red. The first sheet was a letter. If you're reading this, you took the job. Good. You'll need the money or you wouldn't be here. What I'm about to tell you will sound like the ramblings of a man who spent too long alone on a mountain, but you'll follow the rules anyway because the alternative is worse. I don't know what they are. I don't know where they come from. I only know what works. Follow the list exactly. Do not improvise. Do not test the boundaries. When your time here is done, pass these instructions to whoever comes next. Burn nothing. There's a spare copy in the stone box under the porch. Check it every 1st of the month. The second sheet was the map. 14 graves were circled in red ink, numbers 1 through 14. A key at the bottom matched each number to a name and a year. The oldest was 1847, the newest was 1932. The third sheet was titled Standing Rules. I read them twice, before I slept. The rules were specific. 1. Every evening at 7:45, walk the perimeter fence. Start at the gate, move clockwise, count your steps. The full circuit is 2,260 steps. If you count fewer, retrace until the number is correct. If you count more, stop at 2,260 and return to the cottage immediately. Do not look behind you. 2. The 14 graves marked on the map must be checked each night between 9:15 and 9:45. Check them in numerical order. Stand at the foot of each grave for 30 seconds. If the ground is disturbed, smooth it with your hands. If you see flowers, remove them. If you hear your name, do not answer. Move to the next grave. 3. Between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., keep all cottage windows covered. Use the blackout curtains installed on the rods. Do not look outside during these hours. If you hear knocking, do not answer. If you hear voices, do not respond. If the knocking stops and you hear your door handle turn, move to the bathroom, lock the door, and wait until morning. 4. At midnight, perform a radio check on Channel 9. State your name, the date, and the phrase "ground secure." Wait for a response. If the voice on the other end repeats the phrase, acknowledge and sign off. If the voice says anything else, turn the radio off and do not use it again until 6 a.m. 5. No visitors are allowed on the grounds between dusk and dawn. If someone arrives during these hours claiming to be lost, injured, or in need of help, do not open the gate. Direct them to go back the way they came. If they refuse to leave, return to the cottage and follow Rule 3. 6. Every Sunday at 2 p.m., inspect the stone box under the porch. Inside, you will find salt, matches, 3 flares, and a spare copy of these rules. If any item is missing or damaged, replace it before nightfall. If you find something that was not there before, remove it and burn it in the wood stove. 7. Do not enter the woods above the cemetery after 4 p.m. If you are in the woods and hear footsteps matching your own pace, stop moving. Count to 60. Resume walking only if the footsteps have stopped. If they continue, leave the woods immediately by the most direct route. 8. If you see a deer on the grounds at night, observe its legs. Deer move with front legs and back legs in matched pairs. If the legs move in any other sequence, go inside. Do not watch it leave. 9. The graves in the northeast corner, those dating before 1860, must not be approached between midnight and 3 a.m. If you are near them during this window, leave the area without turning your back to them. 10. Once per week, leave an offering at the stone marker near the gate. Acceptable offerings are water, bread, or tobacco. Place the offering at dusk. Do not wait to see if it is taken. 11. If the gate is found closed in the morning and you did not close it, open it before 8 a.m. and check the fence line for damage. Repair any breaks before noon. If you find no damage, make note of it in the log. 12. Do not bring animals onto the property. If an animal follows you in, do not feed it, name it, or allow it inside the cottage. If it remains on the grounds for more than 3 days, leave food at the tree line and call the number written on the inside cover of the logbook. I read the list 4 times that first night. In the morning, I walked the fence line in daylight. 2,260 steps exactly. The fence was chest-high, iron posts and 3 rails of weathered wood. It enclosed the cemetery on 3 sides. The 4th side, the uphill edge, bordered the woods without a fence. A line of stones marked the boundary. I found the stone marker near the gate, a rough piece of limestone the size of a bookshelf, half sunk in the ground. No inscription. I left water in a jar that evening at 6:53. At 7:45, I walked the perimeter. I counted each step, 2,260. The gate stood open. I returned to the cottage and made coffee. At 9:15, I checked the 14 graves. Most were simple stones, names barely visible. I stood at the foot of each for 30 seconds, counting silently. Grave 7 had a small pile of disturbed soil near the headstone. I smoothed it with my hands. The dirt was cold and dry. I heard nothing but wind. At 10 p.m., I covered the windows. At midnight, I performed the radio check. The voice that answered was male, flat, bored. "Ground secure," he repeated. I acknowledged and signed off. I slept in intervals. The first week passed in routine. I learned the property. I walked the fence line every evening and counted. I checked the 14 graves in order. I performed the midnight radio check. The voice always repeated the phrase. On Sunday, I inspected the stone box. Everything was there: salt in a mason jar, matches in a tin. 3 flares, orange and heavy, the spare rule sheet folded and dry. I saw no one. On the 8th night, I heard knocking at 9:37 while I stood at grave number 11. 3 slow knocks, wood on wood, from the direction of the cottage. I finished my count at the grave and moved to number 12. The knocking did not repeat. On the 10th night, I miscounted the fence walk, 2,273 steps. I stopped, retraced 50 steps, and counted forward again, 2,260. I returned to the cottage and locked the door. On the 12th night at 11:40, I saw a deer near the tree line. It stood motionless, watching the cottage. I observed its legs from the window before I pulled the curtain. Front legs together, back legs together. Normal. I began to relax. On the 15th night, the deer returned. I saw it at 10:20 from the porch before I covered the windows. It stood in the same place, near the same tree. I watched it for a full minute. It did not move. When it finally stepped forward, I saw the sequence. Back left, front right, back right, front left. Wrong. I went inside and locked the door. In the logbook that night I wrote, "Deer observed. Protocol followed." The dispatcher on the radio never gave a name. I tried once, on the 18th night after I signed off. "Who am I talking to?" I asked. Static. I waited 30 seconds and repeated the question. The voice came back, slightly different in tone. "Ground secure." I turned the radio off and did not speak to it again until the next midnight check. On the 21st night, I found flowers on grave number 3. Wildflowers, fresh, tied with brown string. I removed them and carried them to the wood stove. They burned quickly. On the 23rd night, the gate was closed. I found it at 7:50 a.m. while carrying the trash to the burn pile. I opened it before 8 and walked the fence line. No damage. I wrote it in the log. On the 26th night, I heard my name. I was standing at grave number 9, counting to 30. A voice, low and clear, spoke from somewhere near grave number 12. "Jacob." I finished my count and moved to grave 10. I did not answer. I did not look toward the voice. At grave 14, I heard it again, closer. "Jacob, I need help." I returned to the cottage and locked the door. My hands shook when I poured the coffee. On the 30th night, a truck came up the gravel road at 8:15. Headlights swept across the cemetery. I walked to the gate. A man in his 50s stepped out wearing a canvas jacket and a feed store cap. He nodded at me. "You the new caretaker?" "I am." "Name's Pruitt. I manage the supply drop. Your uncle and I had an arrangement." "All right. First of every month I bring propane, lamp oil, salt, batteries, and whatever else is on the list. You leave the list in the stone box on the 28th. I pick it up, bring the supplies on the 1st. Money comes out of the trust." "Understood." He looked past me at the cottage, then at the cemetery. "Your uncle was a good man. Quiet. Did his job. I'm trying to do the same." Pruitt nodded. "You read the list he left?" "I did." "You follow it?" "Every night." "Good." He handed me a clipboard with a supply form. "Write what you need. Leave it in the box. I'll see you next month." He drove off before I could ask him anything else. The second month was colder. Frost appeared on the grass in the mornings. I burned more wood. I added a request for firewood to the supply list and left it in the stone box on the 28th. Pruitt brought 2 cords on the 1st, stacked them near the shed, and left without conversation. On the 39th night, I heard footsteps in the woods. I was walking the fence line at 7:52, counting. The footsteps matched my pace exactly. I stopped at step 406. The footsteps stopped. I counted to 60. Silence. I resumed walking. The footsteps resumed. I stopped again at step 512. The footsteps stopped. I counted to 60. This time, when I resumed, the footsteps did not return. On the 43rd night, the knocking came at 2:17 a.m. I was asleep. 3 heavy knocks on the cottage door. I woke and lay still. The knocking repeated. Then I heard the handle turn. I moved to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the tub. The handle rattled twice more. Then silence. I waited until 5:30 until the sky began to lighten before I came out. On the 47th night, I found grave number 6 disturbed. The soil was piled in a low mound near the stone. I smoothed it with my hands. Beneath the surface, I felt something hard. I pulled my hand back. The object stayed buried. I smoothed the soil again and moved to grave 7. On the 51st night, I miscounted the fence walk again. 2,270, I retraced. 2,261, I retraced again. 2,260. I returned to the cottage. My legs ached. On the 54th night at midnight, the radio check went wrong. I stated my name, the date, and the phrase. The response came after a 5-second delay. Grounds disturbed. I stared at the radio. The rules said if the voice said anything else, turn it off. I reached for the dial. The voice spoke again, clearer. Grounds disturbed. Respond. I turned the radio off. My hand was steady, but my chest felt tight. I sat at the kitchen table until 6 a.m. At 6:03, I turned the radio back on and tried Channel 9. Static. I did not attempt another check until the following midnight. The next night, the phrase repeated correctly. Ground secure. I signed off and wrote the incident in the log. On the 60th night, I saw someone standing near grave number 4. It was 9:22. I was at grave number 2 counting. A figure stood 30 yards away, motionless, facing the cottage. Dark clothes, no details visible. I finished my count at grave 2 and moved to grave 3. I did not look at the figure directly. When I reached grave 4, the figure was gone. On the 63rd night, I found a photograph in the stone box. It was not there during the Sunday inspection. I checked the box on a Tuesday evening, retrieving salt to refill the jar in the cottage. The photograph was black and white, creased, showing a man standing in front of the cemetery gate. The gate behind him was painted, not rusted. The man's face was unclear. I burned the photograph in the wood stove. On the 67th night, the deer returned. I saw it from the porch at 6:41, standing in the same spot near the tree line. I watched it until dusk thickened and I could no longer see its legs clearly. I went inside and covered the windows. On the 71st night, I heard voices at 3:55 a.m. 2 voices, conversational, coming from somewhere outside the cottage. I could not make out words. I lay in bed and waited. The voices continued for 6 minutes, then stopped. I did not go to the window. On the 74th night, the gate was closed again. I found it at 7:02 a.m. I opened it and walked the fence line. No damage. In the log, I wrote, "Gate closed, no damage observed." On the 80th night, the knocking came again, 2:31 a.m. 3 knocks, then silence. The handle turned. I was already in the bathroom. I locked the door and sat with my back to the tub. I heard the front door open. Footsteps crossed the main room, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside the bathroom door. I held my breath. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. I waited until dawn. On the 83rd night, I found a letter slipped under the cottage door. I discovered it at 6:15 a.m., a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was shaky. The ink faded. "You're doing well. Keep following the list. Do not deviate. If you see someone you recognize, it is not them. If you hear someone calling for help, they are not in danger. If the count changes, retrace. If the radio fails, wait until morning. You are not alone, but you are safe as long as you comply. Burn this after reading." No signature. I burned it in the wood stove. The winter arrived in earnest. Snow fell twice, light accumulations that melted within days. I added kerosene and extra batteries to the supply list. Pruitt delivered them without comment on the 1st of the 3rd month. On the 92nd night, I heard the footsteps again. I was in the woods at 3:40, gathering fallen branches for kindling. The footsteps started behind me, matching my pace. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I counted to 60, silence. I gathered the wood and left by the most direct route. On the 97th night, grave number 8 was disturbed. I smoothed the soil and felt the same hard object beneath. I did not dig. I moved to grave 9. On the 103rd night, I saw the figure again. 9:31, standing near grave number 7, closer this time. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat. It faced the cottage. I continued to grave 8, counting. At grave 9, I glanced back. The figure was gone. On the 108th night, a car came up the road at 11:20. Headlights flickered through the trees. I heard the engine stop near the gate. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel, a knock on the cottage door. 3 slow knocks. I was at the kitchen table. I did not answer. A voice, female, called from outside. "Hello? Is anyone there? My car broke down. I need help." I did not answer. The voice again, louder. "Please, I know someone's in there. I just need to use a phone." Rule 5. I stood and walked to the door but did not open it. I spoke through the wood. "Go back the way you came. There's a house 4 miles down. They can help you." Silence. Then the voice, closer, just outside the door. "Please, I'm freezing. Go back the way you came." Silence. Footsteps on, the porch moving toward the window. I stepped back. The footsteps circled the cottage. I moved to the bathroom and locked the door. I waited. At 5:42, I came out. The car was gone. On the 113th night, the radio check failed again. I stated the phrase. The response was static, then a voice, different from the usual dispatcher. "Who is this?" I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. "Ground secure." I signed off. On the 119th night, I found the offerings disturbed. I checked the stone marker at dusk and saw that the jar of water I had left the previous evening was overturned. The water soaked into the ground. I placed a new jar and left. On the 124th night at 2:48 a.m., I heard my name again. It came from directly outside the bedroom window. "Jacob." Calm, familiar. I did not recognize the voice, but it sounded like someone I should know. I stayed in bed. The voice repeated, "Jacob, come outside. I need to talk to you." I pulled the blanket over my head and waited. On the 130th night, I miscounted the fence walk. 2,254 steps. I retraced and counted again. 2,260. I returned to the cottage and sat at the table with my hands shaking. I poured coffee and waited for it to cool. On the 136th night, the snow fell heavily, 6 inches by midnight. I walked the fence line at 7:45, counting in the snow, 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves in order, brushing snow from each stone before I stood at the foot. At grave number 6, I heard something beneath the ground. A low sound, rhythmic. I finished my count and moved to grave 7. On the 141st night, I found another note in the stone box. It was Sunday, 2 p.m. The note was folded and placed on top of the salt jar. If the count exceeds 2,270, do not retrace. Go inside immediately and lock the door. Do not leave the cottage until sunrise. If you hear digging, do not investigate. If you see movement at the tree line after midnight, close your eyes and count to 100. Trust the list. Burn this. I burned it. On the 148th night, I saw the deer again. 10:15. It stood near the tree line, motionless. I observed from the porch. Back left, back right, front left, front right. Wrong. I went inside and covered the windows. On the 153rd night, the gate was closed again. I found it at 7:06 a.m. I opened it and walked the fence line. At the northwest corner, I found a section of rail broken. The wood splintered inward. I repaired it with nails and a plank from the shed. In the log, I wrote, "Gate closed. Fence damaged, northwest corner repaired." On the 159th night at 3:12 a.m. I heard digging. The sound came from outside, rhythmic and distant. I lay in bed and counted to 100. The digging continued. I counted to 100 again. The sound stopped. On the 164th night, the knocking came at 1:53 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. I was already in the bathroom. I locked the door and waited. The front door opened. Footsteps. They moved through the cottage slowly, stopping at the bedroom, the kitchen, the desk. They stopped outside the bathroom door. I held my breath. A voice, low and unfamiliar, spoke through the door. "We know you're in there." I said nothing. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. I waited until dawn. On the 170th night, Pruitt arrived with the monthly supplies. He unloaded propane and firewood, then stood near the gate and looked at the cemetery. "Everything all right up here?" he asked. "Following the list," I said. "Good." He glanced at the cottage. "Your uncle had a rough patch in his second year. Got sloppy with the count. Missed a check. Took him a week to get things settled." "What happened?" "He didn't say. Just told me he got it handled." Pruitt looked at me. "You sleeping?" "Enough. You look tired." "I'm managing." He nodded. "You need anything outside the usual, leave a note. I'll see what I can do." He left. That night I walked the fence line and counted carefully. 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves in order. At grave number 9, I found the soil disturbed again. I smoothed it and moved on. On the 176th night at midnight, the radio check went wrong again. I stated the phrase. The response was silence. I waited 30 seconds. Static. Then a voice, faint and distant. "Help us." I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. "Ground secure." On the 181st night, I saw the figure again. 9:41, standing near grave number 12. It was facing me directly. I continued my check at grave 11, counting. At grave 12, the figure was 3 feet away. I could not see its face. I finished my count and moved to grave 13. When I reached grave 14, the figure was gone. On the 187th night, I heard the voices again. 3:32 a.m. 2 voices, conversational, just outside the cottage. I could not make out words. The voices continued for 8 minutes, then stopped. On the 193rd night, the fence count changed. 2,273 steps. I stopped and retraced. 2,271. I stopped. The note had said, if the count exceeds 2,270, do not retrace. Go inside. I went inside and locked the door. I sat at the table until sunrise. At 6:12, I went outside. The gate was open. The fence appeared intact. On the 198th night, I found flowers on grave number 7, fresh wildflowers tied, with brown string, identical to the ones I had found months earlier. I removed them and burned them in the wood stove. On the 204th night, the knocking came at 2:09 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. I was in the bathroom. The front door opened. Footsteps. They moved to the bedroom, then to the kitchen. They stopped at the desk. I heard pages turning. The logbook. The footsteps moved to the bathroom door. A voice spoke, calm and clear. "We're reading your notes, Jacob." I did not respond. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. I waited until dawn. I checked the logbook. The last entry was mine from the previous night. Nothing had been added or removed. On the 209th night, I saw movement at the tree line at 12:37 a.m. I was at the kitchen table reviewing the supply list. I glanced at the window and saw motion in the trees. I closed my eyes and counted to 100. When I opened them, the movement had stopped. On the 215th night, grave number 4 was disturbed. I smoothed the soil. Beneath I felt the hard object again, larger this time. I did not dig. I moved to grave 5. On the 221st night, the radio check failed. I stated the phrase. The response was laughter, low and brief. I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. On the 228th night, I found another note in the stone box. Sunday, 2 p.m. The handwriting was neater this time. You're past the halfway point. The pressure will increase. Do not leave the property. Do not invite anyone inside. Do not answer questions about what you've seen. If the rules contradict, follow the oldest instruction. If something feels wrong, trust your training. You're doing well. Burn this. I burned it. The 4th month began with a storm. Sleet fell for 2 days, coating the cemetery in ice. I walked the fence line carefully, counting. 2,260 steps. I checked the graves in order, brushing ice from the stones. The offerings froze in their jars. On the 236th night, I heard the footsteps in the woods again. I was gathering firewood at 3:51. The footsteps matched my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I counted to 60. Silence. I left by the most direct route. On the 242nd night, the gate was closed again. I found it at 7:04 a.m. I opened it and checked the fence. At the northeast corner, 2 rails were broken, the wood splintered outward. I repaired them with planks from the shed. In the log I wrote, gate closed, fence damaged, northeast corner, repaired. On the 247th night at 9:38, I heard my name while standing at grave number 13. The voice was close, directly behind me. Jacob, turn around. I finished my count and moved to grave 14. I did not turn. On the 253rd night, the knocking came at 1:41 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps. They moved through the cottage, stopping at each room. They stopped outside the bathroom door. Silence. Then a voice, different from before, older. You're going to have to come out eventually. I waited. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 259th night, I miscounted the fence walk. 2,274 steps. I went inside immediately and locked the door. I sat at the table until sunrise. On the 264th night, I saw the deer near the tree line. It stood at 10:18 facing the cottage. I observed from the porch its legs moved in sequence, back right, front left, back left, front right. Wrong. I went inside and covered the windows. On the 270th night, the radio check failed again. I stated the phrase. The response was silence, then static, then a voice that sounded like my uncle. You should leave, Jacob. I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. Ground secure. On the 276th night, I found grave number 11 disturbed. The soil was piled high, nearly a foot above the surface. I smoothed it, working for several minutes. Beneath, my hand struck something wooden. I pulled back and finished smoothing. I moved to grave 12. On the 281st night, I saw the figure at grave number 2. 9:17. It was kneeling at the foot of the stone. I continued to grave 1, counting. At grave 2, the figure was gone, but the soil was disturbed. I smoothed it and moved on. On the 287th night, I heard digging again. 3:26 a.m. The sound was closer, more deliberate. I counted to 100. The digging continued. I counted to 100 again. It stopped. On the 293rd night, Pruitt arrived with supplies. He unloaded and stood near the gate, looking at me. You're thinner, he said. I'm eating. You look like hell. I'm following the list. He nodded slowly. Your uncle looked the same in his 2nd year. Took a while, but he got through it. How long did it take? 1.5 years before he looked normal again. Pruitt handed me the supply receipt. You sticking with it? I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. He climbed into his truck. See you next month. That night I walked the fence line, 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves. At grave number 6, the soil was piled high. I smoothed it and felt the hard object beneath closer to the surface now. I did not dig. On the 298th night, the knocking came at 2:53 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps moved through the cottage. They stopped outside the bathroom door. A voice, calm and measured. Jacob, we need you to open the door. I sat with my back to the tub and waited. The voice again. Jacob, this is important. Open the door. I did not respond. Silence. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 304th night, I found the offerings disturbed again. The jar was overturned, the bread scattered. I replaced them and left. On the 309th night, the fence count changed again. 2,275 steps. I went inside immediately. I locked the door and sat at the table. At dawn, I checked the fence. The gate was open. No damage. On the 315th night, I heard the voices again. 4:07 a.m. 2 voices, conversational, coming from the cemetery. I lay in bed and listened. The voices continued for 12 minutes, then stopped. On the 320th night, I saw movement at the tree line at 1:13 a.m. I closed my eyes and counted to 100. When I opened them, the movement had stopped. On the 326th night, grave number 3 was disturbed. I smoothed the soil and moved on. On the 331st night, the radio check failed. I stated the phrase. The response was a voice I didn't recognize, younger, urgent. Get out of there now! I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. The 5th month was the coldest. Snow fell weekly. The propane ran low. I added extra propane to the supply list, and Pruitt delivered 3 tanks on the 1st. On the 338th night, I heard the footsteps in the woods. I was checking the fence line at dusk near the northwest corner. The footsteps matched my pace. I stopped. They stopped. I counted to 60. Silence. I resumed. The footsteps resumed. I stopped again. They stopped. I counted to 60. This time, when I resumed, the footsteps did not return. On the 344th night, I found a photograph in the stone box. Black and white, creased, the same man standing at the gate. The gate was rusted this time. I burned the photograph. On the 349th night at 9:42, I heard my name at grave number 14. The voice was directly beside me. Jacob, look at me. I finished my count and returned to the cottage. On the 355th night, the knocking came at 1:37 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps moved through the cottage, stopping at the desk. I heard the logbook open. Pages turned slowly. The footsteps moved to the bathroom door. Silence. Then the voice, older, tired. You're almost done. I waited. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 361st night, I saw the figure at grave number 1, 912. It was standing at the foot of the stone facing the cottage. I started my check at grave 1. The figure was 3 feet away. I could see the outline of a coat, but no face. I counted to 30 and moved to grave 2. At grave 3, I glanced back. The figure was still at grave 1. On the 367th night, the gate was closed. I found it at 7:09 a.m. I opened it and checked the fence. At the southeast corner, a post was leaning, the ground around it disturbed. I reset the post and packed the soil. In the log, I wrote, gate closed, fence post disturbed, southeast corner repaired. On the 372nd night, I miscounted the fence walk. 2,276 steps. I went inside immediately. I sat at the table until sunrise. My hands would not stop shaking. On the 378th night, grave number 8 was disturbed. The soil was piled nearly 2 feet high. I smoothed it, working until my hands ached. Beneath, I felt wood, smooth and shaped. A corner. I pulled my hand back and finished smoothing. I moved to grave 9. On the 383rd night, the radio check failed. I stated the phrase. The response was static, then a voice that sounded like my own. Grounds disturbed. I turned the radio off and sat in the dark until 6 a.m. The next night, the usual voice returned. On the 389th night, I heard digging at 3:41 a.m. The sound was close, just outside the cottage. I counted to 100. The digging continued. I counted to 100 again. It stopped. On the 394th night, Pruitt arrived. He unloaded the supplies in silence, then stood near the truck and looked at me for a long time. "You're not sleeping," he said. "I sleep enough. You need to stick it out for another 2 months. After that, we'll talk about getting you some time off the property. I can't leave. You can for a few days, just needs planning." He climbed into the truck. "Hang on. You're doing fine." He left. That night, I walked the fence line. 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves. At grave number 6, the soil was piled 3 feet high. I smoothed it for 20 minutes. Beneath, I felt the edge of a wooden box close to the surface now. I finished smoothing and moved on. On the 401st night, the knocking came at 2:22 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps moved through the cottage. They stopped at the desk. The logbook opened. Pages turned. The footsteps moved to the bathroom door. A voice, calm and familiar, spoke through the wood. "Jacob, I know you're tired. Just open the door." I did not respond. Silence. The voice again, softer. "We're not going to hurt you. We just want to talk." I waited. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 407th night, I found flowers on grave number 12. Fresh wildflowers tied with brown string. I removed them and burned them. On the 412th night, I saw the deer at the tree line. 10:23. Back left, front right, back right, front left, wrong. I went inside and covered the windows. On the 418th night at 9:34, I heard my name at grave number 8. The voice was calm, patient. "Jacob, we need you to stop." I finished my count and moved to grave 9. On the 423rd night, the fence count changed. 2,277 steps. I went inside immediately and locked the door. I sat at the table, staring at the wall until sunrise. On the 429th night, the radio check failed. I stated the phrase. The response was laughter, long and deliberate. I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. On the 435th night, I found another note in the stone box. Sunday, 2 p.m. "You're near the end. The final weeks will be the hardest. Do not waver, do not bargain, do not listen to offers or threats. Follow the list exactly. If the count exceeds 2,280, do not leave the cottage for 24 hours. If you see 3 figures at once, close your eyes and recite the list aloud. You are close. Trust the work. Burn this." I burned it. On the 441st night, I saw the figure at grave number 5, 9:26. It was standing at the foot of the stone, facing me directly. I continued to grave 4, counting. At grave 5, the figure was gone, but the soil was disturbed. I smoothed it and moved on. On the 447th night, the knocking came at 1:59 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps. They moved through the cottage, stopping at each room. They stopped outside the bathroom door. A voice, low and steady. "Jacob, this is the last time we'll ask nicely." I waited. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 452nd night, I heard voices at 4:31 a.m. 2 voices, conversational, just outside the bedroom window. I could not make out words. The voices continued for 15 minutes, then stopped. On the 458th night, I miscounted the fence walk. 2,279 steps. I went inside immediately. I locked the door and did not leave the cottage until the following evening. On the 463rd night, grave number 13 was disturbed. The soil was piled 4 feet high. I smoothed it for 30 minutes, my hands raw and cold. Beneath, I felt the edge of a wooden box, the surface splintered. I finished smoothing and moved to grave 14. On the 469th night, Pruitt arrived. He unloaded the supplies and stood near the gate, watching me. "1 more month," he said. "I know. After that, you can take a week, go into town, sleep in a real bed." "All right," he nodded. "You've done good, better than most would." He left. That night, I walked the fence line, 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves. At grave number 6, the soil was level. I stood at the foot and counted to 30. Beneath, I felt nothing. On the 475th night, the radio check failed. I stated the phrase. The response was silence, then static, then a voice I recognized. My uncle. "Jacob, you need to leave. Now." I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. On the 481st night, I saw 3 figures standing in a line near graves 4, 5, and 6, 918. They were facing the cottage, motionless. I closed my eyes and recited the list aloud, word for word. When I finished, I opened my eyes. The figures were gone. On the 486th night, the knocking came at 2:04 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps moved through the cottage. They stopped outside the bathroom door. Silence. Then the door handle rattled hard and insistent. I sat with my back to the tub and waited. The handle stopped. The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 492nd night, I found the offerings disturbed. The jar was shattered, the water soaked into the ground. I replaced it and left. On the 497th night, the fence count changed. 2,281 steps. I went inside immediately and locked the door. I did not leave the cottage for 24 hours. At dusk the following evening, I walked the fence line again. 2,260 steps. On the 503rd night, grave number 9 was disturbed. The soil was level again. I stood at the foot and counted to 30. I heard nothing. On the 508th night at midnight, the radio check went wrong. I stated the phrase. The response was silence, then static. Then a voice, calm and final. "Time's up, Jacob." I turned the radio off. The next night, the usual voice returned. "Grounds secure." On the 515th night, I saw the figure at grave number 14. 9:43. It was kneeling at the foot of the stone. I finished my check at grave 13 and moved to grave 14. The figure was gone. The soil was undisturbed. On the 520th night, the knocking came at 1:43 a.m. 3 knocks. The handle turned. The front door opened. Footsteps moved through the cottage, slow and deliberate. They stopped outside the bathroom door. A voice, tired and resigned. "All right, Jacob, you win." The footsteps retreated. The front door closed. On the 525th night, I heard the voices for the last time. 3:57 a.m. Two voices, conversational, fading into the distance. I lay in bed and listened until they stopped. On the 530th night, the gate was closed. I found it at 7:06 a.m. I opened it and checked the fence. No damage. In the log, I wrote, "Gate closed. No damage observed." On the 535th night, Pruitt arrived. He unloaded the supplies and stood near the gate. "1 year," he said. "I know. You sticking?" "For now." He nodded. "Your uncle made it 31 years, said the first was the hardest. What about the second?" He said it got easier, not easy. Easier. Pruitt climbed into his truck. "See you next month." That night I walked the fence line. 2,260 steps. I checked the 14 graves in order. All the soil was level. I heard nothing. At midnight I performed the radio check. The usual voice responded. "Ground secure." I signed off and sat at the kitchen table. I opened the logbook and wrote the date, the time, and the phrase. I added a line at the bottom. "Year 1 complete. Ground secure. All protocols followed." I closed the book and poured coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The cemetery was quiet. In the morning, I would inspect the stone box. I would check the fence line in daylight. I would prepare the supply list for next month. I would continue. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. But I was still here. I had followed the list. I had survived. I pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began writing a new copy of the rules, making notes in the margins for the next person. Clarifications, warnings, details I had learned through trial and consequence. When my time came to leave, whenever that was, someone else would take the keys. They would read the list. They would walk the fence line and count. They would check the graves in order. They would cover the windows at 10 p.m. and perform the midnight radio check. They would follow the rules. And if they were lucky, they would survive their first year too. I folded the paper and placed it in the desk drawer. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. I covered the windows one last time, locked the door, and went to bed. The cemetery was quiet. For now.